In Deuteronomy 33 verse 2, we read that Moses was commanded by God to record Israel's journeyings through the wilderness. I would venture to suggest that he was commanded to do this specifically so that we, in these end times, can identify these places and understand the extent of their wanderings. The problem is that when the Jews returned from Babylon and Persia during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, most of the places recorded in the Bible had been destroyed by the Assyrian and Chaldean conquests. They were just dim memories with no one knowing where the places were located, and often the references in the Bible to where those places were located are very vague. However, we are in the fortunate position where we have monumental evidence from Assyria and Babylonia to assist us in identifying some of those places, which means that, using the Assyrian records to guide us, I am able to take you through the complete Exodus journey from beginning to end. In part 1 of this 5-part video series, we shall look at the first part of this journey, this being from Egypt to the Red Sea crossing point. Be prepared for some shock revelations. One of the most controversial topics is the location of Mount Sinai, with numerous candidates being proposed, as well as the body of water which the Israelites crossed. In Hebrew, this body of water is known as Yam Suph, a name which is constantly translated in our various translations of the Bible as Red Sea. There are many proposals for the location of Yam Suph. As Professor Hofmeyr admits, if the term Suph is related to Egyptian Pi-HaHiroth, and I think this is virtually certain in light of Ward's rigorous linguistic investigation of the word, then Yam Suph may have been the Hebrew for the proper name Pi-HaHiroth, a marshy region of the eastern delta. Notice that these experts come to this conclusion because of a linguistic investigation rather than through a study of the Bible itself. But Professor Hofmeyr also admits that the term Yam Suph could have other alternative meanings. Alternatively, Yam Suph in the Exodus narratives may simply be a descriptive term that could have applied to any marshy lakes in the Isthmus of Suez. Notice how he assumes that Yam Suph is close to Egypt. When you start off with this assumption, then you are going to make the facts fit that assumption, when in fact we should be looking at what the Bible actually says. He continues, the crossing of the sea signalled the end of the sojourn in Egypt, and it certainly was the end of the Egyptian army that pursued the fleeing Hebrews. After this event at Yam Suph, perhaps the verb soph, meaning destroy and come to an end, originated. Another possible development of this root is the word sufa, meaning storm wind. The meanings end and storm wind would have constituted nice puns on the event that took place at the Yam Suph. This means that the Hebrew word suph can have a meaning other than the accepted one of reeds. Basically, they are relying on a lot of guesswork. In this video presentation, we shall be using the Bible to identify precisely where the body of water the Israelites crossed was, and show just how shaky these people's interpretations actually are. Whilst the majority of archaeologists insist that Yam Suph was somewhere on the Egyptian border, this being based on their interpretation of the Egyptian records, the Bible always identifies the Gulf of Aqaba as Yam Suph. In 1 Kings 9 verse 26, for example, we are specifically told that King Solomon made a navy of ships in Etzion-Geber, which is beside Elot, on the shore of Yam Suph, in the land of Edom. We know where Elot and Etzion-Geber were both located, so Yam Suph is clearly the name for the Gulf of Aqaba. Note the reference to these places being located in the land of Edom. We shall come back to this statement shortly. In Deuteronomy 1 verse 1, where Moses is giving his final address to the Israelites at a place called Peor shortly before his death, it says that they were at that time in the wilderness in the plain over against Suph. Now, this name Suph has been translated into English as Red Sea, though in the Hebrew the word Suph stands alone. Whether or not there was a region called Suph somewhere between where Moses was addressing the people and the Gulf of Aqaba, I cannot say. If there was, then Yam Suph might simply mean the sea of this place called Suph. When Moses was addressing the people, they were to the east of the river Jordan, around 300 kilometers or 185 miles to the north of the Gulf of Aqaba. So, irrespective of whether Suph was a region or whether this passage is simply referring to Yam Suph, the text is again clearly either referring to the Gulf of Aqaba or some region at the northern extremity of the Gulf of Aqaba, and not some place close to Egypt's border. And then, in Numbers 21 verse 4, we are told that the Israelites journeyed from Mount Hor by way of Yam Suph to compass, that is, go around the land of Edom. We have already pointed out that Etzion-Geber and Elot were in the land of Edom, which means that once again the Bible is identifying the Gulf of Aqaba as Yam Suph. From there they journeyed from Obot and pitched in Abarim in the wilderness to the east of Moab. So they are said to have gone around the land of Edom by the way of Yam Suph to end up to the east of the land of Moab. Now I should mention that there are one or two problems with this latter passage, which I shall leave till part 4 of this video. Nevertheless, the important thing to notice is that the scribes placed Yam Suph close to the land of Edom, so the Gulf of Aqaba is once again undeniably the body of water being referenced. Now, bear in mind that Biblical Hebrew is an archaic language, and as such is sometimes difficult to understand. The directions are not always as clear as one would like them to be. To demonstrate what I mean, consider the following passage from Exodus 23 verse 31, where the Lord tells Israel what land is being given to them to possess. And I will set thy bounds from Yam Suph even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness unto the river. Note that the Lord will set their bounds from Yam Suph to the sea of the Philistines, this being the Mediterranean. This is clearly marking out their southern border, Yam Suph once again being the Gulf of Aqaba, and not some insignificant shallow lake on Egypt's border. What is not clear to most people is the next part, which sets out their northern border. When the Lord talks of the wilderness, he is referring to the wilderness in Syria. From there he draws a line to the river, which river can only be the river Euphrates. And this is even spelled out for us in Deuteronomy 11 verse 24 and Joshua 1 verse 4, when it says, "Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours. From the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even unto the uttermost sea shall your coast be." This passage in Exodus 23 verse 31 cannot be understood any other way, because no northern border would otherwise be mentioned. Why would the Lord tell them what their land would comprise, tell them what their southern border would be, and then remain silent concerning their northern border? Of course, their eastern border would likewise be drawn from the Euphrates back down to Yam Suph, this undeniably being the Gulf of Aqaba. Okay, You have the tribes of Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh who decided to stay in the land located to the east of the river Jordan, but that was not part of the promised land. Before proceeding any further, let me explain that the city of Avaris mentioned by the Greek writers is the place called Havilah in the Bible. As I shall proceed to demonstrate, the claim that Tel el-Dabba in Egypt is Avaris is wrong. There is no letter L in the Egyptian alphabet. Hence Havilah becomes Havirah, which in Egyptian is written Chadvirat, and which, when transliterated into Greek, becomes Avaris. Josephus simply states that Avaris was east of the Bubastite branch of the Nile, this being the translation given by Thackeray in the Loeb Classical Library series, and which I can confirm, having looked at the Greek, is the correct translation. Whiston, in his translation, has Josephus saying that the city was actually located upon the Bubastite Channel, which is wrong. Archaeologists have gone along with Whiston's incorrect translation and are claiming that Tel el-Dabba in Egypt is Avaris. When, however, Josephus tells us that the Egyptians used slaves, which they sent to work in the stone quarries on the east side of the Nile, it doesn't mean that the stone quarries were actually located alongside the River Nile. He uses similar terminology to that used when he describes the city of Avaris. So there is absolutely no reason to assume that Josephus is saying that Avaris was literally located on the Bubastite arm of the Nile. Josephus also tells us that the king was pleased with this injunction and got together all that had any defect in their bodies out of Egypt, and that their number was 80,000, whom he sent to those quarries which are on the east side of the Nile. These workers who were sent out of Egypt to the quarries were lepers, people with disabilities, and any other people who had any defect in their bodies, and will have included those with cut-off noses. Quoting the words of Manetho, Josephus continues by telling us that these people were banished to the city of Avaris, which, we are told, had lain derelict for centuries. This city will have been located outside Egypt, well away from other Egyptian settlements. This makes no sense whatsoever if we identify Tel el-Dabba as Avaris, as this place was well within Egyptian territory. Sir Alan H. Gardiner informs us that Avaris, which he reckoned was located somewhere in the Sethroid nome, appears to lie wholly to the east of the Bubastite or Pelasaic branch of the Nile, and is bounded on the south by the well-located Arabian nome with its capital at Thakusa, the modern Fakus. The chances are, accordingly, that Avaris lay quite close to the caravan route to Syria, which is now known to have started somewhere near Kantara. He also tells us, indeed, it appears not impossible that Per-Ramses, that is right next door to Tel el-Dabba, may have been built on the site of Avaris itself, though this is mere conjecture. Archaeologists have turned this conjecture into an accepted fact. If, however, Pi-Ramses was a royal city, they would not have wanted lepers and other outcasts living nearby. At the beginning of the Egyptian 18th dynasty, a certain Ahmose son of Eabana, who was a naval officer in command of Ahmose I's navy, tells us that he accompanied the Egyptian king when he rode abroad in his chariot to conquer Avaris. When it says rode abroad, it means that they left Egypt proper. According to the German archaeologist Kurt Steth, the name Avaris means the town of the desert strip, which description, in my opinion, hardly fits the site of Tel el-Dabba. Gardiner informs us that Avaris is associated with Sekhedzah in a war scene at Memphis, which was seen by the German archaeologist Heinrich Karl Bruch and dated to the time of Ramesses II. On several stelae and statues currently in the Cairo Museum, a place called Taru is also associated with Sekhet-Zar. Taru appears to be an abbreviated form of the name Khadfirat, this latter name, according to Gardiner, being the Egyptian form of the name Avaris. During the time of the 18th dynasty king Horemheb, offenders had their noses cut off and were banished to Taru, a city which is said to have been built, or more correctly rebuilt, by Horemheb. This is the place which in later times was known as Rhinocorora, the name Rhinocorora meaning cut off noses. Josephus likewise tells us that lepers and others suffering various maladies, including mutilated persons, that is, those who were physically disabled and presumably those with cut-off noses, were banished to Avaris during the reign of a king named Amenephis, this presumably being an alternative name for Horemheb. With my reconstruction of the Egyptian history, which was covered in my two-part video presentation entitled Manetho on Trial, Horemheb would have been a contemporary of Sennacherib, king of Assyria. The Greek writer Diodorus dates this banishment of lepers and other physically disabled people to the city of Avaris to the time of Shabaka, who he called Agdisanis, dating him to some ridiculously early period, long before the time of Amenemhat III of the 12th dynasty. According to my research, Shabaka was a contemporary of Horemheb, which means that Diodorus was correct in claiming that this occurred during the time of Shabaka, but erred in dating Shabaka to a far too early period of Egyptian history. Havilah, Avaris, Taru and Rhinocorora, sometimes written Rhinocolora, were therefore all one and the same place. Bear in mind that there are no signposts saying this is the city of Avaris. The identification of Tel el-Daba as Avaris is based on nothing more than conjecture. Avaris appears in the Bible as Havilah, so knowing where Havilah was located is going to help us in the next part of our investigation. Let's assume for a moment that the Gulf of Aqaba is the sea that the Israelites crossed through on dry land, and take this investigation to the next level. If this is the case, that the Gulf of Aqaba was the sea the Israelites crossed, then the Wilderness of Shur has to be over here to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, as the Bible makes it perfectly clear that they arrived in the Wilderness of Shur after crossing Yam Suph. Let's see how this affects our understanding of the following biblical passages. In 1 Samuel 15 verse 7 we read, "And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah as thou goest to Shur, that is over against Egypt." In the Septuagint, instead of over against Egypt, the Greek is translated as facing Egypt, though both are valid translations of the Hebrew. Now, do you remember what I said about how biblical Hebrew, being an archaic language, was difficult to understand? Archaeologists have read this passage as meaning that Shur was over against Egypt, but that is not what the text is actually saying. As we have just demonstrated, Havilah is Avaris, this being the place which in later times was known as Rhinocorora. So when it says that Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah to Shur, the Bible is telling us that Saul conquered the whole of this southern region bordering the land of Judah. By placing Shur over here next to the Egyptian border, it has the impact of people grossly underestimating the importance of King Saul's campaign. When the Bible uses the words Alponei Mitzrayim, translated as over against Egypt, it doesn't mean that Shur was over against Egypt as has been assumed, but rather that this whole region between Havilah and Shur was over against, or more correctly facing, Egypt. Do you see what has happened here? People are misinterpreting what the Bible is saying. The following passage from the book of Genesis uses the same terminology, but adds another important statement which helps us to understand more clearly what the Bible is telling us. And they, that is the Ishmaelites, dwelt from Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt. Again the same terminology as above, but this time it adds, as thou goest toward Assyria. The Septuagint once again has facing or opposite Egypt, and has until one comes to the Assyrians instead of as thou goest toward Assyria. But in both cases the intention is the same and could not be clearer. Think about it. Again, we draw a line from Pi-HaHiroth to the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, this being from Havilah to Shur, and then the statement as thou goest toward Assyria makes perfect sense, because it is referring to the King's Highway, this being the main trade route between Egypt and Assyria which existed at that time. If, however, you place Shur over against Egypt as archaeologists have done, you are not only confining the Ishmaelites to a very small area, but the words as thou goest toward Assyria make absolutely no sense whatsoever. There is no way that you can explain this if Shur is placed over here against Egypt. We find further confirmation of the correct placement of the Wilderness of Shur in 1 Samuel 27 verse 8, where we are told that David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. For those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. So let's examine this passage more closely. First of all, note that the Geshurites dwelt in the land of Bashan in northern Israel. This land was located to the east of the river Jordan. We are likewise told that the Gezrites of Gezer dwelt around Mount Ephraim in northern Israel. As already demonstrated, the Amalekites dwelt all along the southern border of the land of Judea. This then is describing a clockwise circuit of the lands from Bashan in the north down to Shur, which is to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, and then around the southern part of Judea as far as Egypt. Do you now see how this all fits together? This statement concerning David's conquests only makes sense if you place the Wilderness of Shur to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba. If you place Shur over here against Egypt, and you draw a line from Bashan to this location, you are not only cutting off a significant part of the land of Israel, but you are also cutting off the whole of the land of Judea. I think that this alone puts an end to any argument which may be raised as an objection to the identification of the Gulf of Aqaba as being the sea which the Israelites crossed. This, however, is not the only piece of evidence. Now, I don't know about you, but if the Gulf of Aqaba was known as Yam Suph, I cannot understand how people can claim that Yam Suph means Sea of Reeds. Considering the depth of the Gulf of Aqaba, where in places it is understood to be around 2 miles deep, the idea that it can be called a Sea of Reeds simply does not make sense. In my opinion, it is much more likely that Yam Suph was named after a region at the northern extremity of the Gulf of Aqaba, a region which is referred to in Deuteronomy 1 verse 1 and which has been translated as Red Sea. Add to this the fact that in Numbers 21 verse 14, reference is made to a book of the wars of the Lord, and whilst the King James Bible adds what he did in the Red Sea and in the brooks of Arnon, the Hebrew actually says Vaheb in Sufa and the rivers, that is Nachalim, of Arnon. You will find that this is how the Revised Standard Version has in general translated this passage, though they have translated the word Nachalim as valleys instead of rivers. We shall revisit the meaning of this word Nachal in part 4 of this series of videos. The important thing to note here is that once again there is the suggestion that Suph, here simply called Supher, was the name of a region. With this belief that Yam Suph is a sea of reeds, you can well understand how people can be easily misled into believing that the Lord took Israel through a shallow lake where the sea had been parted by a strong wind. If, however, Israel crossed through the midst of the Gulf of Aqaba, then we are talking about something truly miraculous. And today, in a society where everything has to be explained by naturalistic causes, such a suggestion is simply rejected outright as being impossible. The fact is that the Bible often refers to the Gulf of Aqaba as Yam Suph. And if this is the sea that was parted, then when the Bible talks about Israel passing through the depths of the sea, we have to accept that it means depths and not some shallow sea of reeds, as is being claimed by a lot of highly respected people. The prophet Isaiah states that the word of the Lord, which of course is the Bible, was unto them precept upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line, line upon line, here a little and there a little, that they might go and fall backward, and be broken and snared and taken. As I have just demonstrated, you have to put all the pieces together in order to make sense of what the Bible is saying. We have here aptly demonstrated how this works by looking at 3 different passages identifying the Wilderness of Shur, and by comparing these passages, we have demonstrated that the Wilderness of Shur had to be to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba. The land of Goshen was in the Egyptian delta. Marvellous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt in the field of Zoan, we are told in Psalm 78 verse 12. In verses 42 to 44 of that psalm, we are further told that they remembered not his hand, nor the day when he delivered them from the enemy, how he had wrought his signs in Egypt, and his wonders in the field of Zoan, and had turned their rivers into blood, and their floods that they could not drink. The Hebrew word sadeh, which is translated as field, should here be translated as land. This word can mean field, country, or land. In Genesis 14 verse 7, for example, this word sadeh is correctly translated as country when talking about the land of the Amalekites. It is universally accepted that Zoan is Tanis in Egypt. The land of Goshen was therefore located in the delta. The Bible tells us that the Egyptians were urgent upon the people, that they might send them out of the land in haste. For they said, we be all dead men. They left in haste. They wanted to get as far away from Egypt as they could. The first place they camped after leaving Egypt was at a place called Succoth, a name which means tabernacles or booths. The place was therefore named after these Israelites who camped there. It is generally accepted that Succoth was located on the Egyptian border, where the lakes Timsah and Bala are located. The scholarly disagreement occurs over which way they went after this. Moses was specifically commanded not to take the road to Philistia. And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt.
One thing I want to bring up is that it says that they weren't supposed to go north. It says they weren't supposed to go the way of the Philistines, which is along the Mediterranean.
That's right.
So how do you explain that?
Well, they don't start off that way, do they?
The suggestion by David Roll that they disregarded this commandment makes no sense whatsoever. The whole point of not going in that direction is because of the wars which were going on in that region. To have gone that way would not only have been dangerous, but would have been in complete disobedience to the word of the Lord. In Exodus 13 verse 20 we are told, "And they took their journey from Succoth and encamped in Etham in the edge of the wilderness." Again, remember what I said about Hebrew being an archaic language. Etham was not a specific place. It was a region. In modern English, we would probably say that they encamped at the edge of the wilderness of Etham. In the Egyptian papyrus known as Anastasia 6, Etham appears variously as Atima, Atma, and Atuma. It states, "We have allowed the tribes of the Shasu of the land of Atuma to pass the stronghold of King Mernptah of the land of Succoth towards the lakes of Pitom of King Mernptah of the land of Succoth, in order to feed themselves and to feed their cattle in the great estate of Pharaoh." The lakes of Pitom were here. Notice that Succoth is here called the land of Succoth. It was not the name of a town or city. If I am right, then this place was so named because of the Israelites who at one time camped there, which then means that Mernptah must have lived sometime after the Exodus. So Succoth was the name of a region. The Swiss archaeologist Edouard Naville likewise considered Etham to be the name of a stretch of land rather than that of an actual town or city. The Shasu are said to be an Asiatic tribe who dwelt in the land which we today know as the land of Israel. It can be shown that the Shasu were Israelites, and that King Mernptah mentioned in the above quotation was a contemporary of Siddekiah, king of Judah, though for expediency we shall not go into that here. If you have not already done so, you might want to watch part 2 of my video entitled Manetho on Trial. These Shasu tribes were escaping from the Chaldean king Nebuchadnezzar, who at that time was invading the land of Israel. After crossing Yam Suph, this being the body of water we are now identifying as the Gulf of Aqaba, the Israelites ended up in the wilderness of Etham. And they departed from before Pi-HaHiroth and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness, and went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham, and pitched in Marah. In Exodus 15 verse 22, this wilderness of Etham is also called the Wilderness of Shur. Having shown that the Wilderness of Shur was located to the east of the Gulf of Aqaba, then this Wilderness of Etham is synonymous with the land of Edom, a land which is called Wilderness of Edom in 2 Kings 3 verse 8. So why is this significant? Let me first of all give you a short exercise on some simple phonetics. Nowadays we have dictionaries to assist us in how to spell words. Because there were no dictionaries in the ancient world, you would get a great variation in the way names and words were spelt. If we consider some of the names in the Bible, for example, we see that Jehoiachin, son of Jehoiakim, was also called Jeconiah and Coniah. I accept that these are the anglicised forms of the names, but the same principles apply to the Hebrew. Azariah, son of Amaziah, was also called Uzziah. Eliam, the father of Bathsheba, was also called Amiel, father of Bathshua. In the case of Bathshua, it is my opinion that this name should be read Bathsheba, the vav being pronounced as a V rather than a U. Note also the father's name has undergone a metathesis. Joshua, son of Nun, was also called Hoshea and Jeshua, though in Hebrew Joshua and Jeshua would be pronounced Yehoshua and Yeshua respectively. When we look at other languages, we find similar occurrences. In the Alamana letters, for example, Neb Matre Metkateb 3 is variously called Nibmuaria, Nimuria, Imuria, Mimuria, and so on. The city of Tamar in Ireland was variously called Temor, Temrach, Temrach, Temre, Temhur, Temher, Temoria, Tara or Tara, to name but a few variations on the spelling of this name. There are plenty of other examples which could be given. The interchange between the letters T and D in ancient languages is also well attested. For example, the Jews were called Eudosis by Tacitus. The Medes, who are called Madai in Hebrew, were called both Madai and Matai in the Assyrian records, both names being used interchangeably. The city of Tachpanches in Egypt was called both Daphne and Daphne by the Greeks. In the Alamana letters, the king of Mitanni was called both Tushrata and Dushrata. Edagama, the man of Kinzer, is also variously called Etakama, Etugama, Edakama, Itakama, Itakama, and so on. Note also the interchange of the letters G and K. As you can see, there was a huge variation in the way names were spelt, something which understandably a lot of scholars seem to have difficulty with. As for the name Etham, Edward Naville informs us that Rouget, Chabas and Bruche have transcribed the name of Atuma as Edom, considering that the Egyptian character, which is represented by a hieroglyph for hand, here being translated as a T, generally transcribes the Hebrew letter D or Dalet. It is certainly rare to find the Hebrew letter Tav corresponding to this Egyptian hieroglyph. However, these transcriptions from the Semitic languages do not follow an invariable rule. In other words, the name they are reading as Etam can also be read as Edom. This would suggest that Etam is a variant spelling of Edom, and that the land of Edom is intended. It would certainly make sense now that we have identified the wilderness of Etam as the wilderness of Edom. As I pointed out earlier, the land of Edom is called wilderness of Edom in 2 Kings 3 verse 8. The name Etam is synonymous with the name Edom, the difference between the two names being the one letter, a tav in the one name and a dalet in the other. As for the name Edom being written with an extra letter, this being the letter Vav, this type of variation is to be expected, and I have just given you a number of examples of how names were written a number of different ways with different characters. In most places in the Hebrew, the name Edomites, despite being translated in the plural in the English Bibles, is actually written Edom in the singular. But in 1 Kings 11 verses 1 and 17, Edomites is twice written in the plural without the Vav. In verse 1 as Edomiot, this being the feminine plural form of the name, and in verse 17 as Edomim. Now that we have demonstrated that the wilderness of Etam is the same place as the wilderness of Edom, we have added an extra piece of evidence to support the Gulf of Aqaba as being the site of the Red Sea crossing. The scribes who restored the text from the ashes during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah clearly did not make this connection. In Exodus 14 verse 2 and in Numbers 33 verse 7, when they had arrived at the border of the wilderness of Edom, Moses was commanded to turn round and to go to Pi-HaHiroth. In Exodus 14, the King James Bible uses the word turn, whilst in Numbers 33, the King James Bible uses the words turned again. But the Hebrew word yashav used in both passages more correctly means turned back. This has been appropriately addressed in later translations, such as the New International Version and the Revised Standard Version, which have correctly translated as turn back. They therefore went down this wadi, which leads to Nuwayba beach. This wadi is known as the Wadi Watir. Notice how I am pronouncing this name. The reason for this will become evident in a moment. When one looks up the meaning of Watir, we find that it means soft, snug, cosy, comfortable in reference to a bed or a seat, or smooth when referring to a cloth. This makes no sense whatsoever in relation to this wadi. There is today a road which runs through this long winding wadi, and as you can see from this footage, it is anything but soft, snug, cosy, comfortable or smooth. Look at how rough the ground is at the end of the wadi, where it opens out onto Nuwayba beach. The name Watir is totally inappropriate for this wadi. Let's assume for a moment that Watir is a metathesis of Khirat. This would then make the name equivalent to the Hebrew Khirat, as in Pi-HaHiroth and Pi-HaHiroth. This will involve the swapping of the ear and the at in what is known in phonetics as a single metathesis. So, what does Khirat mean in Arabic? Well, brace yourselves for this. It means difficult or critical situation, difficulty, trouble, plight, predicament, awkward position, dilemma, fix, jam, embroilment or bad entanglement. Does this by any chance ring any bells? All of these meanings describe the situation the Israelites were in when they reached the Red Sea crossing point. Yes, we have yet another piece of evidence which now nails down Nuwayba beach as the crossing point. So let me just quickly touch on this subject of metatheses, as these were far more common in ancient languages than most scholars seem to appreciate. A metathesis is where two or more sounds or letters in a word change places. For example, the people of Glasgow are called Glaswegians rather than Glasgowians. The French call mosquitoes moustiques. Note that the Q and the T have here swapped places. In Old English, the word for bird was brid. There are plenty of other examples which could be given. In the Bible, we have Hushim son of Dan, who is also called Shucham son of Dan. Ard son of Benjamin, who is also called Adar. The Maonites in Judges 10 verse 12 are called Ammonites in Judges 10 verse 6. These are the same people, but are called Maonites in the one verse and Ammonites in another. We have already mentioned Solomon's mother, Bathsheba. She is called daughter of Eliam in the second book of Samuel, but daughter of Amiel in the first book of Chronicles. The names Eliam and Amiel are written with the same Hebrew characters, but the name has undergone a metathesis. Hopefully you can now see how Watir is a metathesis of Khirat. Now for the reason why I am pronouncing the name of this wadi as Wadi Watir rather than the conventional Wadi Watir. Whilst dwelling in Spain, the Arabs gave Arabic names to a number of Spanish rivers. Guadalquivir is derived from the Arabic Wadi al-Kabir, meaning great river. Guadalcanal is also a derivation of Wadi al-Canal. Guadalajara from Wadi al-Hijara, meaning river of stones. Notice how the Arabic letter, which is today pronounced waw, is transliterated in each case as a G. This shows that the waw is a guttural, which means that it has the same value as the Hebrew letter chet, as in Chirot. Similarly, Josephus referred to Hebron as Gibrona, where the Hebrew letter chet has been transliterated as a G. The Arabic letter waw and the Hebrew letter chet therefore at one time had the same phonetic values. Both are what are known in phonetics as gutturals. There is therefore no reason why Wadi Watir, which is today called Wadi Watir, cannot be identified as the biblical Hiroth, as in Pi-HaHiroth, a name which means mouth of the Hiroth. Before going any further, I would like to clarify an error which Ron Wyatt made. He suggested that Nuwayba al Muzzayinah means waters of Moses parting, but this reading is contrived. This is Wadi Watir. This is Nuwayba Beach, where the Israelites were entangled in the land. Today there is a road which runs out at the southern end of the beach, but at that time there was no way off the beach. It might not be clear from this map, but this is the Gulf of Aqaba. At the southern end of this beach, though not actually on the beach itself, is this place called Nuwayba al Muzzayinah. The name Nuwayba is Old Arabic and is said to mean either springing water or bubbling springs on account of the many water wells spread over this area, from Naba'a meaning to spring from a source. Likewise, Yanbu'a is a well or a spring. The Muzzayinah were a Bedouin tribe who at one time dwelt in this region. The name Nuwayba comes from Nuwayba Castle, which was built by the Egyptians in 1893, but built over an older castle, also called Nuwayba, built by the Ayyubids in the 12th century of the Common Era. The idea that Nuwayba al Muzzayinah means waters of Moses parting is therefore wrong. But what about the names Migdol and Baal Zephon? Speak unto the children of Israel that they turn and encamp before Pi-HaHiroth, between Migdol and the sea, over against Baal Zephon. Before it ye shall encamp by the sea. In the book of Numbers, the words before Migdol are used instead. As has been pointed out by David Roll and others, Migdol was in Egypt. In the book of Jeremiah, it reads, "The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the Jews which dwell in the land of Egypt, which dwell at Migdol, and at Tachpanches, and at Noph, and in the country of Pathros, saying..." Tachpanches, called Taphnas in the Septuagint, is the city known to the Greeks as Daphne or Dephene. It was on the Peloponnesian branch of the Nile. Migdol here appears to be referring to some unknown location in Pelusium in the Egyptian delta, somewhere which during the time of Jeremiah had a Jewish settlement. But does this have any bearing on the argument? The Israelites were in the middle of nowhere. None of these places the Israelites camped at were at that time inhabited. So when the Bible states that they were between Migdol and the sea, Migdol in Egypt would probably have been the closest landmark. There is no reason to suppose that any other location was intended. Bear in mind also what we said earlier about how Israel is described in Deuteronomy 1 verse 1 as being over against Suph when Moses was addressing the people to the east of the river Jordan. This despite them being around 300 kilometres, that is around 185 miles, north of the Gulf of Aqaba. Another alternative interpretation of Migdol has recently been suggested based on an entry in the Hebrew and Chaldee lexicon to the Old Testament by Friedrich Gesenius, published in 1860, which states that Migdol in Coptic Egyptian means abundance of hills. This statement, however, is erroneous, as the word Migdol, whether in Egyptian, Coptic or Hebrew, simply means tower. It does not mean an abundance of hills, as he claims. In fact, he even gives his source for making such a claim. But when you check his source, as you can see here, Champollion does not make any such claim. Champollion quite clearly states that Migdol means a tower. In French, the word tower being written T-O-U-R. Migdol therefore means a tower, and there is no evidence to show that there ever was a tower at Nuwayba. The reference to Migdol must therefore be referring to Migdol in Egypt. At Nuwayba Beach, they most certainly would have been located between Migdol in Egypt and the sea. The expression before Migdol must likewise mean before, as in over against Migdol. So what about Baal Zephon? This name means Lord of the North, or simply Lord of Saphon. In Greek, the name Saphon becomes Typhon, a name which in Egyptian is associated with Seth, who I identify as Esau. It is possible that Baal Zephon was the ancient name for Elot, sometimes called Elat, both names being used interchangeably in the Bible. This place originally belonged to Edom, as we are told that Solomon went to Etian Geber and to Elot at the seaside in the land of Edom. We are also told that this place changed ownership a number of times. In the second book of Chronicles, for example, we are told that King Azariah, also known as Uzziah, built Elot and restored it to Judah. In the second book of Kings, we are told that Rezin, king of Syria, recovered Elat to Syria, and drave the Jews from Elat, and the Syrians came to Elat and dwelt there unto this day. In the Hebrew, the word translated as Syrians is Aromim, which in itself is unusual, as we would have expected this word to be Aramim rather than Aromim. The Hebrew text actually has a footnote against this entry of Aromim, saying that we should instead read Edomim, that is, Edomites. This correction is also supported by the Septuagint, where it says that Idumeans settled in Elat. In fact, Elat was thereafter called Elan or Elana, after the Edomite duke known as Elon the Hittite. The Gulf of Aqaba was also thereafter known as the Elonites Gulf, after this tribe of Elonites. Rezin was himself an Edomite, being a descendant of Hadad the Edomite. Note that this reclamation of the city of Elat to Edom occurred after King Azariah had restored it to Judah. Elat is the Hebrew name for the city. It is therefore possible that this city was known as Baal Zephon during the time of Moses. As for this confusion between the words Aramim and Edomim, I shan't go into it here, but there are a number of other places in the Hebrew text where the Hebrew letters Resh and Dalet have been confused and swapped. The scribes have misread the character when copying the original texts, which would have been badly damaged by fire. This problem will be covered more fully in part 4 of this video series. Interestingly, there was a place, town or village of Saphon located in the land of the Amorites to the east of the river Jordan. We know from other passages that Edomites were also dwelling in these regions, so the name Saphon was probably associated with Edom. As the book of Joshua records when talking about the land allocated to the tribe of Gad. And in the valley, Bet Haram and Bet Nimrah and Succoth and Etham, the rest of the kingdom of Sichon, king of Heshbon, Jordan and his border, even unto the edge of the sea of Kinneret, on the other side Jordan eastward. This place called Succoth will be revisited in part 4 of this video series, when I shall suggest that this was one of the many campsites that the Israelites stayed at. Hence the name Succoth, meaning booths or tabernacles, these being temporary dwellings. It is also possible that Saphon is a contraction of Baal Zephon. Consider, for example, that Mount Hermon, mentioned in Joshua 11 verse 17 and various other passages, is called Mount Baal Hermon in Judges 3 verse 3. This being the case, the statement that they were over against Baal Zephon might simply be a reference to this place called Zephon, which was part of Gad's inheritance. Obviously, this is all conjecture on my part, but I thought it worth mentioning as I want to be as thorough as I can and to provide food for thought. I want to spend a moment or two looking at the various meanings which have been proposed for the name Pi-HaHiroth. Pi-HaHiroth literally means mouth, entrance or opening to the Hiroth. Josephus even used the word stoma, meaning mouth. When we use the word mouth in a geographical sense, it means the entrance to something, as in the mouth of a river, meaning the place where the river empties into a larger body of water, such as a lake, sea or ocean. We are certainly not talking about a canal, which is one of the arguments being put forward by archaeologists for the meaning of Hiroth. You cannot camp at the mouth of a canal. Note that Pi-HaHiroth is called Pnei-HaHiroth in Numbers 33 verse 8, meaning before or in front of the Hiroth. Hiroth is not a Hebrew word. The closest is either chor or chur, meaning whole, or chara, meaning to burn or glow with anger, none of which would become Hiroth. The suggestion by some people that Pi-HaHiroth means mouth of the gorges, a suggestion that is gaining in popularity, is simply false. There is no way that Hiroth can mean gorges. Rashi, one of the most influential Jewish commentators of the 11th century, would have us believe that the word Hiroth is from the word cherut, meaning freedom. This word, however, appears to be of late usage, as it is never used in the Bible. In biblical Hebrew, the word chofshi is used to mean free. Rashi records, that is Pitom, but now it is called Pi-HaHiroth, since there they, that is the Israelites, became free men. Hebrew, B'nai Chorin. They, that is the Hiroth, are two high upright rocks, and the valley between them is called the mouth of the rocks. Rashi clearly did not have a clue what he was talking about. Pitom was one of the store cities in Egypt. When Israel reached Yam Suph, they did not arrive at an Egyptian store city. By that time they were well outside Egypt. Pi-HaHiroth was not an alternative name for Pitom. Having shown that Hiroth is the Wadi Watir, and that Hiroth is derived from the Arabic word Hirat, it means that Hiroth is a transliteration of the Arabic. We therefore don't need to look for a Hebrew etymology. Pi-HaHiroth is mentioned in the Egyptian records. Edward Naville comments, in the tablet of Philadelphus there is frequent mention in connection with Pi-Kerechet of horses which are brought there, and of cattle given to the sanctuary for its annual income. Now if we revert to the Papyrus Anastasi and to the Shosu of Atuma, we see that they asked to drive their cattle in the pastures which belonged to the estate or to the farm of Pharaoh. The Egyptian word ach means a farm where cattle or horses are bred, an estate with livestock upon it. If we look at the passage in Exodus where the route of the Israelites is described, we find there that the Septuagint, who made their translation during the reign of Philadelphus, and after them the Coptic version, instead of mentioning Pi-HaHiroth, have written Aponantites Epolius before the farm, the exact translation of the Egyptian ach. The Greek word epolis means a place to pass the night in, especially for cattle, a farm building or country house. It does not mean a migdol or fort. During the time of Moses, there was nothing there other than high hills at either end of the beach. The mention of Epolius in the Septuagint is an anachronism. The structures which are today to be seen at the north end of the beach, which some people are claiming were probably the Migdol mentioned in the Bible, post-date the Exodus by many centuries. Pi-HaHiroth, which is also written Pi-HaHiroth, note the metaphysis, appears in what is known as the Philadelphus tablets. However, there is no indication as to where this place was located. Neither of these forms of the name can be compared to the Egyptian word keret, meaning canal, a word which appears to be related to the Hebrew word kara, meaning to dig or to excavate. Keret would therefore mean a cutting or a trench, which is effectively what a canal is. David Rohl and others argue that there was a canal in Moses' time which cut off their means of escape, and are applying this interpretation to the biblical statement in Exodus 14 verse 3 that Israel was entangled in the land, the wilderness has shut them in. Herodotus informs us that this canal was started by Pharaoh Necho II and was completed by Darius I, king of Persia, and we have several huge stelae confirming this statement that Darius I completed the work on this canal. In Manetho on Trial Part 2, I demonstrate that Pharaoh Necho II was the king also known as Ramesses II, and we have written evidence from the Egyptian records confirming that Ramesses II was responsible for starting this canal. The trouble is that archaeologists have assumed that the canal was already in existence in the Egyptian 18th dynasty because Queen Hatshepsut set sail on the Red Sea to go to the land of Punt and returned to Egypt by sailing down the Nile to Thebes. The reason they make this assumption is because they believe that the land of Punt, the land which we know as Phoenicia, was at that time located in Africa. This is simply not true. I have demonstrated that Queen Hatshepsut was the biblical queen of Sheba, where Sheba is the Hebrew transliteration of the name Theba, a name which in Greek is written Thebes. Queen Hatshepsut set sail on the Red Sea, landed at Etienne Geber, travelled to Jerusalem, and from there travelled to Tyre, which is on the Mediterranean coast, and it is from there that she set sail for home, returning down the Nile to Thebes. The idea that the canal existed prior to the time of Ramses II is therefore based on pure conjecture. In short, the canal which David Rohl and others are relying on for their versions of the story simply did not exist in the time of Moses, hence could not possibly have been the cause of the Israelites becoming shut in by the land. This completely destroys their argument for a crossing place close to Egypt. Do you see how one error leads to another leads to another? Having demonstrated that the Wadi Watir is more correctly Wadi Khirat, and having demonstrated the meaning of Khirat to be describing the situation the Israelites were in when trapped on this beach at Nuwayba, the land having shut them in, then I do not think that we need to look for any other alternative interpretation of Pi-HaHiroth. So, as you can see, there is a lot of evidence which points to Nuwayba Beach being the place where the Red Sea crossing took place. In Part 2, we shall proceed to dismantle the arguments which are being put forward against this crossing point, and explain why the columns which used to stand on either shore are not Roman as is being argued by David Rohl. So join me in Part 2 of Journey Through the Wilderness for more enlightenment.